When I first came to United as a student in September of 1974, my class was the first class that had a large group of women. We were 1/3 of the entering class. The groundwork had been laid for an inclusive language policy that came into being actually in the fall of 1974. And a course was already being offered on women and the church, taught by Gail Graham Yates. So we were indebted to those early few women students who preceded us. My class, as was the way in the 1970s, began a women's caucus here, and many of the women in my class participated in it. And we continued to push and to challenge the faculty and the administration of the seminary to address issues of gender equity. We particularly pushed that the inclusive language policy that was in place be followed in the classroom by the faculty, and that gender analysis be included in the courses that were being taught, and that the seminary hire more women faculty. We also said that we needed a space just for the women students. We saw ourselves as still being in a very male-dominated institution. And so, as part of the Women's Caucus work, we asked for a space for women. That was granted, a small room down in the classroom wing, and we named it the Antoinette Brown Archives and Women's Space. And we inaugurated that space with a very celebrative service in which we used images like the bread is rising, and we danced Sarah's circle instead of climbing Jacob's ladder. It was, I think, the work of the women in the 1970s and 80s that laid the foundation for the formal women's studies program, which began in the 90s.
When I think back about why we started the women's studies program, it seems to me that there were 4 key reasons for us. The first, and obviously most compelling, was that there was strong consensus among the whole faculty that oppressive discourses about gender and its attendant practices of sexism were operating very destructively in the church and world, and we needed to do something about that. We needed to prepare our students to do something about that in their ministries. We needed to help them learn how to reclaim women's voices in theology, in the church, in practice. We needed to help them deconstruct dominant discourses that were doing so much harm, and we needed to help them join the conversation about constructing new ways to do theology and ministry in keeping with God's liberative hopes. So that was obviously our most compelling reason, and we felt about, all of us felt about it very strongly. But the second reason was we had an amazing group of people, a critical mass of women scholars who were doing top-notch feminist research. And those kind of resources weren't available at other seminaries. We couldn't ignore that kind of resource. We felt we had to use it, and it was appropriate to use it in a women's studies degree concentration. And then, third, there was a sense that we had a methodology, an integrative practice that was both heuristically and practically useful for the seminary. We were able to use a method in this program that crossed the boundaries of all theological disciplines, and that crossed the boundary between theory and practice, between personal and professional formation, across the vast variety of social justice issues. We always believed that oppressive discourses were interlocking and not competitive, and that added to our integrative potential. So that was also a key reason for doing this work, this integrative methodology that I think benefited the school in general, as well as the program. And then fourth, we enjoyed ourselves. We had a lot of energy around this work. It fed our research, it fed our enthusiasm, it fed our sense of mission and ministry. We made partnerships across feminist academicians and schools, and local, national, international relationships that joined us in this work. It was a powerful time. And I think at some level, maybe a lot of us felt that at some point, maybe even within this 20-year span, our program would end up being maybe irrelevant, or at least not as crucial as it was when we started it. But oppressive gender discourses are alive and well. They operate insidiously and explicitly in church and world, and we don't have a choice about addressing them. So this program is as crucial as it ever was, for better or for worse.
The Women's Studies program at United has an impact that extends beyond the more visible components, like the Susan Draper White Lectures or the June Women's Studies courses. Those are really important, but others will talk to them. I want to talk about the less visible impact of the program and lift up two things in particular. First, and very importantly, the program has helped to ensure that women's studies issues, gender justice issues, are taken seriously throughout the curriculum and throughout the student body. This has happened for different ways. One is that the students who come because of the program, whether they stay and graduate with a concentration in women's studies or whether they experience a call to ministry and graduate with an MDiv, they come with very strong commitments to gender justice and to justice in general. And they heighten the awareness to those issues of other students, of their student colleagues, and even of the faculty. I think it's fair to say that gender justice issues permeate the entire curriculum. Indeed, most recently, as we in the women's faculty were talking at a women's studies committee meeting about how dangerous it is that we might become complacent now that women are a majority of the student body and a majority of the faculty and we have a woman president. We developed a set of benchmarks which is being used across the curriculum to hold each of us teaching here at United, not just women's studies, but all classes, accountable to including gender analysis in a certain percentage of courses, to making sure that we have diverse women's voices, that such voices are represented in all of our curriculum. And I think that's really important as we move forward. Second, it seems to me that the Women's Studies program has been one, not the only, but one of the key factors in encouraging United to engage justice issues more broadly. The faculty women at United believe that women's studies involves not only resisting sexism, but also racism and classism, any form of structural domination, and that it involves fostering a healthy multiculturalism. And this is played out in various ways too. It was the women's studies faculty which suggested that we, to the faculty at large, that we have a justice and peace concentration. We came up with the idea in one of our brainstorming for the future sessions in the Women's Studies Committee, brought it to the faculty, which adopted it wholeheartedly, which took it to EP&E, and now we have a peace and justice concentration in all of our degree programs. We've also been responsible for bringing in speakers and June course teachers from outside of our own social locations. So we've had people from different ethnic groups, people from different faiths. We've had Buddhists and Jews and Hindus. We've had the first woman to get a constructive theology degree in Sri Lanka come and speak to us or teach our classes. And I think that has had an impact far beyond the matters of gender justice. I'm very excited about what's happened in the last 20 years, and I'm very excited to see what happens in the next 20 with the Women's Studies program at United.
Beginning in the 1970s, the second wave of feminism began to really hit theological education in the churches. And so since that time, there's grown up a tremendous feminist theological movement across all the disciplines of theological education and across all the seminaries in this country in one degree or another. And it's really transformed theological education. I did my seminary education in 1971 to 74 at a major mainline Protestant seminary. Had a faculty of over 30 scholars. When I went there were 2 women on full-time appointment, one in Christian education, which was the classic women's subject, and one in Old Testament who had been appointed just a year before I came as a student. There was a 3rd woman teaching biblical languages on a part-time instructor contract, and while I was there, a new assistant professor in pastoral care, who was a woman, was hired. But it was a heavily male faculty. In the classroom, if not all, nearly all the textbooks that we read were by men, mostly white men. And what that meant was that education had a huge hole in it. And that's not true anymore. There certainly are seminaries where that's still the predominant picture, but in many seminaries, now there are, as there are here at United, many women on the faculty. We are a majority of women on our faculty, both regular and adjunct. And in any syllabus that a student picks up, women's voices are amply represented in the readings, required, recommended. Women's experiences in the classroom fully represented in all its diversity in women colleagues, where we now have a student body that's 2/3 women. And frankly, we owe that all to this feminist theological movement of which the United Seminary Women's Program is an early and major representative. As far as what the Women's Studies program at United has meant specifically for United, you really could say it's made us the seminary we are today. This representation of women, this representation of perspectives growing out of women's experience, this representation of women all across the institution is really the result of the Women's Studies program. Because that is here, there are people on the faculty now that might not otherwise have come here, where they came specifically because we had this program and it created an environment for a kind of conversation, a kind of openness and inclusion they were looking for. We have students who are here because of that. Not necessarily so much to concentrate in women's studies per se, but because the work of women's studies and the perspectives of all of these parts of the church that white men historically had excluded from voice or public voice, but because now that's all welcomed, that's accessible here. And so every student who walks out of the doors of United has been shaped by the perspectives that the Women's Studies program presents, even if they never took a Women's Studies course, because those perspectives are infused in nearly every course that's taught here. So it's, as I said, it's really made us the school we are.
As one of the first participants in the Women's Studies program, I was able to benefit from the knowledge and experience of wonderful faculty members such as CHRISTIE NEUGER, Marilyn Salmon, CAROLYN PRESSLER, and Wilson Yates, who taught me to honor my worldview as a spiritual woman who chooses to work in a secular profession. As a registered nurse who is now working in a consultative role, I've had the opportunity to work with and for women throughout my career. The Women's Studies program taught me to honor the stories and lives of these women. Whenever I go into a new work situation, as I have done again recently in Newport Beach, California, I take the time to listen to the stories of the women with whom I work, both from a professional level as well as a personal level. These stories offer a glimpse into what motivates the women to come to work every day and helps me know how to most effectively work with them, to inspire them, and to counsel them should that become necessary. I, of course, do the same with the men with whom I work, and so I also wish to honor some of the male faculty at United, such as Paul Capitz, who taught me that it is possible to have both a gentle spirit and a disciplined mind. When I applied for a job in Florida over 10 years ago, it was my focus on feminist theology that my male boss was most intrigued in, and he gave me the opportunity to advance my career in many new directions during our 7 years of working together. I am very grateful to United for starting the Women's Studies program during my tenure at United. I recall going to Wilson Yates' office, asking him to start the program shortly after he was named dean. At the time, I was a casual student, taking courses that interested me. When the program was announced less than a year later, I told myself it was time to get serious about my theological studies, so I enrolled in the program and was one of the first graduates. So, in short, the Women's Studies program has opened doors for my career as a woman in healthcare and has enabled me to create a partnership, community-based model with the teams of people with whom I have had the opportunity and pleasure to work.